Good morning. My name's James Stanger on a cold, wet, windy Australian winter's morning. I'd like to talk today about PGT-A in the real world as opposed to clinical trials or a in-house data set. This was a paper published a couple of days ago, May 2026. In the UK, PGT-A is associated with a reduced live birth rate in routine practice, evidence from the UK ART register. And the four or five authors are highly respected people with a lot of experience in IVF. So this isn't so much a review because this is not an open access article. I understand it may become open access in the future. So I can really only discuss the material in the abstract, but I believe the observations are important and hence a quick and possibly boring video, except of course from the comments at the end, so you should hang around for that. The question was, does the use of pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy PGT-A improve the treatment success in routine IVF practice? A bespoke dataset from the HFEA register was used to analyse a cohort of all available treatment episodes, that is the oocyte retrieval and all associated transfers in the UK for cycles which started between 2014 and 2018. So it's 5 or 6 years old, this data. It also included whether the intention to treat was for IVF or PGT-A or testing for monogenic diseases, which they call PGT-M. Now, overall, there were 112,000 treatment cycles, including for 2,500 patients who received PGT-A and just over 2,000 patients who received PGT-M at any point. I was actually surprised at that number. That's 2,000 cycles or patients that had testing for monogenic diseases in those 5 years. To me, it's quite a lot. And I think this goes a bit under the radar in most IVF cycles. I'm not aware of it in Australia very much. Maybe in the UK, there's pushed a lot more. In fact, we should do more videos on that because I think it's actually quite an important area of IVF. I also just wanted to make a comment that a lot of work, and I'll probably make a comment towards the end, is that when I was reading this paper, it struck me as being really important because most stuff now requires a randomized clinical prospective trial to decide whether something is worthwhile. But in many cases, it's not possible to do a randomized trial. And one way to do it is like I discussed in my video on single embryo transfers, is to create a digital model of what you would expect to happen if it was a randomized trial. But the other way is just to use real data, a whole data set with hundreds of thousands of cycles. And I'm inclined to actually prefer this sort of data. So 112,000 cycles of 2,500 people having PGT-A, or that's an awful lot of cases. And if you include all the data set that's been included for the goes to the regulatory body, is actually what I think they're right. This is actually real life, and I think this is better, I think, than a randomized clinical trial because this is actually the real data. You may draw different conclusions, but something which you can't ignore. So logistic regression models comparing PGT-A and PGT-M to standard IVF cycles without PGT-A that are made with careful adjustment for age, cause of infertility, previous IVF treatments, ICSI injection, number of oocytes, number of embryos, and treatment center. Live birth events, multiple births, and pregnancy loss were considered for both the first treatment cycle, following the pickup, and for the cumulative transfers for all site transfers after the initial oocyte retrieval. And I think they're doing different things, but the cumulative live birth rate is actually really where people are going and analyze treatments. And I have to say, spoiler alert, nearly every cumulative live birth study that's been done has shown no difference between treatment and no treatment. There's something inherently basic about putting back all the embryos and seeing how you go, as opposed to putting back the first one. So the results, PGT-A was associated with a decrease in live birth rates from the first transfer, right? And for the cumulative live birth rates compared to standard IVF. So in other words, if you opt to have blastase transfer and PGT-A, you're going to end up with a lower chance overall of having a baby. But there were but there's reasons for doing that, and one would be for pregnancy loss. So the authors noted that pregnancy loss was reduced per pregnancy in the first cycle and overall cumulative pregnancy rates. Right. So one reason for doing PGT-A is to actually be concerned about risk of miscarriage, and you can hedge your bets by doing PGT-A, but even though you may end up with a slightly lower chance of having a baby. But the really important thing is in this data set, it's almost incomprehensible that 48% of PGA treatment cycles, there were no embryos were transferred. So for IVF, only 5%, only one case in 20 didn't have enough embryos to transfer, but more than half the people that elected to have PGT-A didn't get to transfer. That is, they actually didn't have embryos after they didn't get to blastocysts, or they came back with they're all euploid, and that's a big call. So the HFEA register from 2014-28 showed the PGT-A used in routine care was associated with a reduced live birth rate and a reduced pregnancy loss compared to standard IVF. And I'm going to show you some of the data from that paper on the basis that I've been told by the author that it is to be open access, and so therefore I'm not breaking copyright rules. If I am, I do apologise. A couple of points. This is the age characteristics of the three data sets. This is the IVF one. You can see here that the average age is 35. The mean range 31 to 38. But the 35 to 37 year age group was the group that had the most number of cycles. But if you look compared to PGT-A, the average age was 39. So obviously a lot of reason for doing PGT-A was because of age. And you can see here the peak age, the mode was between 40 and 42, which is getting pretty old even for IVF. And interesting for PGT-M, these are all young. These are all people they're not infertile, they're fertile, but they carry a history of a genetic trait, or they may have had a baby before that had a genetic trait that they don't wish to run the risk of with another pregnancy. And I'm a strong supporter of that. And you can see here that in fact there is there's a big spread between 26 and 37. But once again, the most common one was the same for IVF, which is 30 to 35, 35 to 37. Still a bit old. I would have thought this would have been younger, quite frankly. But here's the data. And this is the thing that really worries me. These are the cases. So the 107,000 IVF cycles, 2,500 PGT-A. So roughly about 1 in 6 cycles about 1 in 7 cycles, 1 in 6 had PGT-A, and about 1 in 6 also had PGT-M. So the critical thing which I really got out of this, and this is a thing I'm very strongly opinionated on, is that look at the number of people that didn't get to transfer. 5% for IVF, 48% for PGT-A. These are ones that didn't have, all the embryos were euploid or highly mosaic. And in fact, at this time frame, most mosaics were being not transferred, whereas now, of course, nearly half the mosaics are being transferred. 40% euploid, 40%, 50% aneuploidy, and 10 to 20% mosaics, and half the mosaics are light mosaics, and they've now been transferred, often being called euploid, just to make things really confusing. And 32%, roughly about a third of people having testing for monogenic diseases didn't have a transfer. And I think you probably would have expected somewhere between 25 and 50%, excuse me, depending on the genes being synced. So that would be in accordance with, but note here that these embryos are being tested for the presence of a particular gene, genetic status in the embryo. And as I understand, they're not being tested for euploidy. So even though these embryos may not carry the trait that they don't wish to transfer, they have no idea about the euploidy status. And the other interesting thing was in IVF, 92% of people had a fresh transfer, and only 8% the pregnancies came from frozen transfers. I think that's a really interesting set of data because that means that in an IVF cycle, half of those will be day 3, day 5, I assume. I don't think that was said in the data set. Nearly all the pregnancies are coming from fresh transfers. And that has implications, for instance, in rates of pre-eclampsia, which are double in frozen transfers. But what I find interesting is that a quarter of the cases had fresh transfer, and I think that reflects a time very early on in PGT testing, when in fact the embryos were tested overnight and transferred on day 6, or they may have actually been day 3 biopsies, which um, I, has problems in its own right. But you need to take that into account when you're looking at the poor outcome for PGT-A. The data here that a third were cleavage and 2/3 were blastocysts, whereas for PGT-A they were all blastocysts, and they were all blastocysts for PGT-M. So the data really for this is the live birth event per cycle. This is the pickup cycle, a live birth event from fresh frozen. 1 in 3 women had a baby in IVF from IVF. 1 in 4 had a baby in PGT-A, and 1 in 4 had a baby with PGT-M. And it's a bit hard to understand that because theoretically, the good embryos are going to be euploid, and the good embryos are going to be put back with the fresh one with IVF or PGT-A. And so I'm not actually, the authors don't even really talk about why this is a little bit lower, but it does suggest that maybe some embryos which have the potential to give live birth have been discarded based on the PGT-A results and also going to blastocysts. But the pregnancy rate loss is something that we need to, and in this case, most people talk about a pregnancy loss rate on IVF to being something around about 25%, and for PGT-A to be about 12%. And so I don't actually quite understand this. Now, maybe I'm missing something here, but it might actually be that they're discounting, or the clinical is only looking for live fetal hearts. But both cases demonstrate that the difference between PGT-A and IVF is actually very similar. So the full pregnancy loss, even after, full pregnancy loss, that's clinicals, I assume, and fetal hearts, 4% that's really low. But it's actually a little bit, it's actually still higher than PGT-A, which is 3%. So this is a bit of data which I don't quite understand, that overall in the HFEA data, they actually only need a pregnancy loss rate of 4% of all the cycles started. And so, I mean, that may, if you go back and look at the pregnancy rate so it's 4% of cycles started. So the chance of having a miscarriage from when you start IVF is 4% when you have your pickup, and it's 3% when you have PGT-A. If you fall pregnant, it will suddenly gets to be a bit higher because only a third are pregnant. So that takes you up to about 12%. This takes you up to about 6%. Okay. And the last thing is the authors also had this graph compared to IVF. This is the chance of having a live birth by age with PGT-A, and you can see once again a really consistent set of data in almost all studies now showing that people under 30 go backwards when they have PGT-A. So if you're using genetic testing on young women, I think for whatever reason you're going to end up with fewer live births. But the data starts to creep up, and in the really old age, I've got to be apologise for that, very mature, 43 to 44, they're just starting to get a little bit better with PGT-A for really older women, but not significantly so. And for PGT-M, where we're not looking at aneuploidy, we're just looking at age, you can see that this follows a general trend that compared to IVF, there is a slight decrease and that it falls off the cliff when you're over 40. So these are all largely aneuploidy losses, etc. When you're actually filtering down the gene pool, the number of oocytes you have, you might have 10 oocytes, 7 embryos, but a quarter to half of those, depending on what mutation you're trying to get rid of, will be removed from the pool. So it's just the net effect of having a smaller embryo pool to choose from for transfers. So my comment, I'll just make my ugly not a bit smaller. The data used in this study was 8 to 12 years old and may or may not bear little relation to the current status of PGT-A, particularly with the type of genetic testing being done. So a lot of the PGT-A testing was done using very old technology, whereas nearly everything now is done with next generation sequencing. So you need to recognize that maybe the conclusions here may not bear any relationship to what's happening in 2026. Of the 112,000 cycles, including 2,500 for IVF and 2,000 for PGT-M at any point in the episode, this is a lot of clients right across the client spectrum. It's also very diverse with that PGT-A infertile clients and PGT-M, which are fertile clients. There may be some issues here to impact on the observations, but in reality, whether someone's fertile or not has very little to do with outcome in IVF. IVF seems to ride a roughshod over all that data except for the client's age. The only thing that matters is the age of the woman, the age of the oocytes. The data does support many other observations that there are fewer miscarriages after PGT-A, indicating about half miscarriages may be due to aneuploidy, and this in itself is a strong reason for doing PGT-A. The real issue is about half of all clients using PGT-A do not get to transfer, and some of these may be normal, some of them may not. And so the problem with PGT-A is you're throwing a lot of embryos out, some of which just might have potential form of pregnancy and a live birth if you put them back. I don't really understand how, if half the PGT-A clients did not have a transfer, you would assume that pregnancy rate would be higher, but why is the pregnancy rate lower? It does suggest that embryos transferred after only embryos assessments are similar to those diagnosed with euploid by PGT-A. That is, the best embryos you see with the naked eye and are the ones that you are most likely to be euploid, and therefore the ones you're going to select out by PGT-A testing. Another reason may be that there are many mosaic embryos that were being discarded that may have produced a live birth, or the biopsy may have reduced the viability, although several studies have suggested this is not so. It could actually be that mosaic embryos, so currently about half of them embryos that are mosaic are very low level mosaic. So most of the cells in the embryo are normal, and a few of the cells are abnormal. And the general consensus of those is they have, if you put those back, they have a very high chance of pregnancy, but only about 70% compared to total euploid embryos. If you put back mosaic embryos where more than half the cells are aneuploidy, then they have a very poor chance of implantation and more miscarriages. So another option might be that mosaic embryos were discarded that had a potential to produce a pregnancy, or the biopsy may have reduced their variability. There may have been several reports arguing that AI may be better than the naked data, but this data doesn't suggest that. It's almost self-evident, even to the client's eyes, which embryos look the best. The problem with PGT-A is that it's expensive and requires all the embryos to be frozen, whereas with many, well, not so much for this paper, but all current PGT-A cycles are frozen with next generating sequence. It takes a while to do that, and therefore requires all the embryos to be frozen, whereas for IVF, many have a fresh transfer. Actually, I cannot tell, but the data does suggest that only 95% have a transfer. But almost all studies report that the miscarriage rate is half PGT-A, and if asked, I suspect many clients will still have PGT-A to minimize that risk. However, this data does suggest that per egg collection, pregnancy loss is actually very modest. So maybe the miscarriage rate being cited per pregnancy really overstates the risk of miscarriage. If you fall pregnant, about a quarter of IVF pregnancies will miscarry, and about a sixth to 1/7 will miscarry after PGT-A. So that is, so if you're a client, you would choose PGT-A. It's more expensive and more likely to lead to not having transfer, but consider, if you consider the small increase in losing your pregnancy, is it worthwhile? There is also the other aspect that since nearly the embryos are being frozen, there's a real risk now using artificial stimulation cycles with PGT-A of risk of pre-eclampsia, which are significant up to 1 in 5. And so there's quite a high perinatal risk for doing PGT-A because the embryo is being frozen. So also note that because the PGT-A pool includes PGT-A and PGT-M PGT-M clients, the pool of embryos being transferred may not be the same. PGT-A is selected on euploidy and PGT-M is selected on the presence of a specific genetic profile. It will also reflect why so many clients did not have a transfer. Something specifically reported in the abstract as the PGT-A effect. The poorer result may reflect differences in age and biopsy and also vitrification effects. And we do have to recognise, keep an open mind that blastocyst culture may not necessarily be in the embryo's best interest, and some embryos may suffer because of the environment. And once again, several studies, including this one, have suggested that PGT-A is less suitable for younger clients and may favour the older client. Early on, nearly all mosaic embryos were not transferred, whereas currently, at least embryos with less than 50% mosaic cells or aneuploid cells are now being labelled euploid. So the definition of euploid is changing dramatically. Also, much has changed in the last 10 years that may render these observations less relevant. Still, overall, using PGT-M or A has not delivered a superior likelihood of live birth, putting pressure on clinicians to justify its recommendation to all clients. And in reality, when you think about it, you have 6 or 8 embryos and you put the best ones back, and if not, you freeze the rest. And even if you get rid of half the embryos, which are aneuploidy, you're still going to put back all the euploid embryos, so you would expect, in fact, that the pregnancy rate to be the same. It's just the only question is, are you less likely to have a miscarriage? And if that's important to you, then a PGT-A might be superior. And it might also be that you just might have a pregnancy sooner by having fewer transfers, but you might also not have a transfer at all. At least with day 3, you put some embryos back, you give them a chance. You can tell myself I'm a fairly strong supporter of day 3 transfers, but a lot of clinicians and a lot of embryologists just absolutely discard day 3 transfers and are so totally committed to PGT-A regardless of what happens. And they do not countenance the fact that some embryos may not survive to go into day 5, and they may well benefit from being put back early into the stimulating environment of the uterine environment. So my name's James Danger. I'm an embryologist with 50 years experience for what it's worth. These videos are my FirstAid's YouTube channels and my attempt to bridge the gap between information you may need for your treatment and the most publications. Now, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical person, and this information is not medical advice, but it may help you knowing what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor and maybe to help in understanding the advice you receive. If you like what I'm doing, press subscribe and tell all your other friends and whatever to about the channel, and leave a comment if you like. This is supported by my FirstAid EQA program, online EQA program in IVF and in embryology. And I'd just like to thank you if you got this far. I know IVF is a personal journey that involves the action of many people, technique and concepts, and helps to understand all aspects of that journey. I hope this information may be of value. Please tell us about it and please subscribe. And I think I'll say goodbye at this stage, and I'll see you again on another video.